Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jessamine Battario, and I am the Lindy Family Foundation Curator of Academic Engagement at the Colby College Museum of Art. I'm speaking to you from the homelands of the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn, which is made up of the Abenaki, the Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and the Penobscot. We express our respect to the indigenous communities who have lived on these ancestral lands for almost 15,000 years and to the future generations. With this acknowledgement, we recognize the legacies of settler colonialism, and we signal an ongoing commitment to building relationships with the Wabanaki. On behalf of the museum, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to tonight's edition of our Art and Program series, which brings together the voices of visiting artists, scholars, museum staff, and community members for conversations about the exhibitions, collections, and projects at the Colby College Museum of Art and its Lunder Institute for American Art. If I could have the next slide, please. Tonight's program is related to our exhibition of Jacob Lawrence's print series, The Life of Toussaint Louverture. In the late 1930s, Lawrence completed a series of 41 paintings of Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary figure, general, and leader. Then, nearly 50 years later, in the late 1980s, Lawrence revisited the topic and created 15 works, this time in the medium of silkscreen prints. Through the generosity of Peter and Paula Lunder, and in honor of President David A. Green and Carolyn Green, the entire print series was acquired for our museum's Lunder collection in 2020. The exhibition is on view until June 5. Our installation presents the prints in the narrative chronological order of Toussaint Louverture's life, from his birth and early days as a coachman to his role as a strategist and general for the revolution, his capture by the French, and finally, the continuance of the fight for freedom. Can I have the next slide, please? Haiti proclaimed its sovereignty in 1804, becoming the only state in history established after a successful revolt by enslaved people. The Haitian Revolution was a defining moment in the history of the Atlantic world. Made nearly 200 years later, Lawrence's print series attests to this historical moment's legacy on the cultural imagination, precisely because the revolution had repercussions across and beyond the region. If you could take down the slides, please. So tonight we will hear two scholars engage with one another to situate Lawrence's print series in the Afro-Hispanic Caribbean context. Before I introduce them, I would like to take note of some technical housekeeping. We will leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions from the audience. At any point during the conversation, please feel free to submit your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Alexandra Mendez, our Lindy Family Foundation Coordinator of Academic Access, will moderate the Q&A. And closed captioning is also available if you click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And now for the introductions. Dr. Nicolás Ramos Flores is an assistant professor of Spanish at Colby College, where he teaches courses in Caribbean and Latinx studies. He researches the intersections of racial discourse, memory, and masculinity in Latinx, Caribbean, and Afro-Latin American communities. You can find his article on the zombie figure in Hispaniola in the open access journal, Hispanic Issues Online. His co-edited volume called Hemispheric Blackness, Bodies, Policies, and the Exigencies of Accountability in the Afro-Americas is forthcoming this year in 2022 and explores the resistances of Black lives in the Americas. He also has a forthcoming article on Afro-Latin American masculinities in Revista de Estudios Hispánicos. His current research analyzes trauma and Puerto Rican identity through the Pulse nightclub massacre commemorations in Orlando, Florida. Ramos Flores earned his PhD in Hispanic Literatures, Cultures, and Linguistics at the University of Minnesota in 2019. Joining him is Dr. Vanessa Valdés, the interim dean of the Macaulay Honors College at CUNY for the 2021-22 academic year. She is the former director of the Black Studies program at the City College of New York, CUNY, a graduate of Yale and Vanderbilt Universities, and a professor of Spanish and Portuguese. Her research interests focus on the cultural production of Black peoples throughout the Americas, the United States and Latin America, including Brazil and the Caribbean. She is the editor of The Future Is Now, A New Look at African Diaspora Studies, and Let Spirit Speak, Cultural Journeys Through the African Diaspora. She's also the author of Oshun's Daughters, The Search for Womanhood in the Americas, and Diasporic Blackness, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Her latest book, Racialized Visions, Haiti and the Hispanic Caribbean, is an edited collection that recenters Haiti in the disciplines of Caribbean and more broadly, Latin American studies. And with that, I will turn the program over to Nico and Vanessa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessamine, and thank you, Vanessa, for being here. And thank you, everybody, for coming to tonight's conversation. So I've had the pleasure of talking and engaging with Vanessa for a couple months now, and I think it should be sort of an enlightening and engaging conversation. Just to cover some, not logistical things, but to give you guys a sense of what we're going to be doing. We have some sort of prepared questions, but we do envision this to be more of a conversation between us two. And we will open it up at the end, as Jessamine said, to questions. And with that, I think what I think would be a good opportunity right now is to sort of have Vanessa introduce what is the Haitian Revolution for the audience. If you can have sort of a succinct answer to that question before we get into the nitty gritty of how it impacted the Hispanic Caribbean, the rest of Latin America, I thought it would be a good way, heavy question, but a good question to start the discussion with.
Let's just start light. First of all, I want to thank Jessamine and Alexandra and you, Nico, for this invitation. The Haitian Revolution. So many of us, when we study US history, right, we start with in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And then we skip to the Pilgrims and Mayflower and things like that here in this country, right? Whereas for the Spanish Empire, that moment, you know, Columbus lands on what would be called La Española, right? What is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And so that island, which the indigenous name of which is Haiti, right? A-Y-I-T-I, you know, the land of mountains. That is the center of Atlantic history. And it is a way in which we don't study it that way. And so from that moment, shortly thereafter, the Spanish crown allows for enslaved peoples to be trafficked into that land in 1501, which is only 9 years later, right? And so from that moment, enslaved peoples, both coming from Spain itself, and then quickly thereafter, within a few decades, coming from the African continent, right? That transport happens immediately. And so again, when we talk about, during this Black History Month, when we talk about genocide and enslavement really being structures upon which all of the societies in this hemisphere are built, we really mean from the moment of inception, right? There were enslaved peoples, not in the way that we think of, but there were both free Black peoples on Columbus's ships, but also there were enslaved peoples, again, not in a way that we understand when we think of it as US plantation, right? But they were there, right? Enslavement was on the enslavement was throughout the European continent. And so when we think about the Haitian Revolution, that really is, if we start at 1502, the Haitian Revolution starts at 1791, right? So that's already almost 300 years of context in which enslavement is, again, pervasive throughout this hemisphere, and not solely throughout this hemisphere, but throughout this hemisphere. And so it is in that context that when we see enslaved peoples rise up on a French colony, during which at the same time, you know, France is also dealing with their own uprisings, right? Clamors for freedom and revolution, right? Over there, right? Down with Louis XVI, we see that there's a moment, and then like the uprising, you know, liberté, fraternité, égalité, all of that is a context as well, because free Black men in particular on the island and on Saint-Domingue and that colony saw what was happening in France and said, well, we want to be voted, we want to vote too. We want to be part of the estate as well. And so it's always much more, it's funny because I was like, yeah, light question. It is so much more nuanced and complex that we know. And yet the final results of it was that it continues to be certainly the largest uprising of enslaved peoples and the most successful, right? Not the only, but the successful one that resulted in the creation of a state and a nation. That is the Haitian Revolution.
No, thank you. Thank you for that sort of a historical background of leading up to the revolution. When we spoke earlier this week, we sort of discussed a lot of things, but one of the things that I thought would be interesting was, do I have access to the changing of the slides? I don't know if we could, or do we bring those up later? I wanted to bring up the quote by Ralph Trujillo, one of the things that I sort of want to begin engaging with. And one of the things that we were discussing was sort of what place of the Haitian Revolution in broadly, not just the Hispanic Caribbean, I know the sort of the title of this program is the Afro-Hispanic Caribbean, but we know that the Haitian Revolution had a major impact, not just in the Caribbean itself, but also Latin America and in the US as sort of this pivotal moment. But at the moment, and even now when you either talk to colleagues, historians, and people don't know the significance of it. So there's this famous text that sort of is canonical at this point called Silencing the Past by Michel Ralph Trujillo, who's a Haitian-American anthropologist. And he has this in one of the chapters is called An Unthinkable History, where he defines the Haitian Revolution as an unthinkable history. Sort of long story short, just the quick thesis is that he explains in there how the Haitian Revolution, at the moment that it occurred, it was sort of automatically dismissed because of the realities of the incomprehensibility of it to Western epistemologies at the time. And he asked this question in this chapter called An Unthinkable History: if some events cannot be accepted even as they occur, how can they be assessed later? In other words, can historical narratives convey plots that are unthinkable in the world within which these narratives take place? How does one write a history of the impossible? And thinking through that, particularly that last question, how does one write a history of the impossible? I wanted to sort of start engaging with this idea of what is the place of the Haitian Revolution when it was so impossible at the moment. I know that in your edited volume, The Racialized Visions, you engage with that question quite a bit. And just to start engaging with what does it mean for the impossibility of the revolution, and how does it impact then discourses in the Caribbean and beyond?
Yeah, I think it's very, very important to focus on impossible to who, right? Because when we talk about the Haitian Revolution, we again are talking about a series of uprisings that took place over the course of 13 years, right? This wasn't a month. And, if we think about, newspapers at the time, it was a long time, people had to cross the Atlantic. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about years in which it is happening. And so what Trujillo does in that chapter is that he is citing French. Well, at the time, we're talking about the philosophers, right? We're talking about, again, this is the Enlightenment. This is what many of us who are traditionally taught are taught to think about as the height, right, of all of these discourses of freedom. And so it was certainly possible to those who were engaged in it. It was possible to those who knew of it, not only, again, on that island, but certainly, there were Black peoples here in this hemisphere, both enslaved and free, and they knew what was happening, right? And so whether it was ships that were coming and going, that were traveling in the hemisphere, there were still ships coming from Africa. There was still communication that was happening. And so, the conversation, it reminds me of a comment that I share with my students. Toni Morrison, upon her reaction to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, was invisible to who, right? So again, because if we're talking about, are you invisible to your family? Are you invisible to your loved ones? And so again, the question is, who is writing the history? Right? Because again, if these histories, if what was happening, of course it was documented in newspapers, but to what extent, right? Who owns the newspapers, right? It's a whole questioning of how media works. And even at that time, and those of us who work in the archives know, certainly, in the tradition, those who in particular, work on histories of enslavement and freedom, you look in the absences as well as what is actually stated. We have become accustomed to doing so. And so I always, the body of my work is about focusing the attention on not those necessarily who wrote the histories, but those who have escaped in some way, or have been overlooked, who've been marginalized, sometimes who have escaped, right? Historical discourse, deliberately or not.
Yeah, no, I think what's interesting with the Unthinkable History, he sort of goes through, for those of you who haven't read it, he sort of goes through sort of a list of the moment of the ways that it was just consistently dismissed.
Yep.
And he sort of lands on this point that they were like, which I think is a sort of interesting thing that he takes, which is like, they didn't have the bandwidth to do it, to conceive of this enslaved person uprising in 1804, and like you're saying, and through the years. Before we sort of go on, because I wanted to bring in some sort of more contemporary thinking through the earthquake in 2010. One of the things that I think is interesting with the Haitian Revolution is the way that it sort of impacts then thinking through an African-American artist, which is Jacob Lawrence, sort of the museum's art collection right now. You had some interesting thoughts on this next image. We'll come back to this Unthinkable History point in a second, but the thinking through one of the series, title of the image is called La Flotilla. The Flotilla, sorry, I put a Spanish spin on that one. The Flotilla. And I was wondering if you could sort of, I know that you didn't create this specific piece of art, but what do you make of this piece specifically in relation to the way that the all-encompassing nature of French influence on the island, and thinking through this moment in the image in history of the Haitian Revolution?
Well, I think it's interesting because in the context of the series, what that particular panel is one in which it is later on in the series, and it is again when about 10 years into the revolution, what we call the revolution, Napoleon sends ships, right? And so they are on the waters outside of the island, and that's important to recognize that this was fought on land, but there was a constant naval threat, right? A threat of invasion. And outside of the context of the series, just taken on its own, it reminds one that, again, once the revolution succeeded in 1804, some of the things that most people don't know about Haiti is that it is we talk about the glory of, the uprising and success, but it is also the only formerly enslaved society where they were forced to pay indemnities to the colonizer, right? And so those payments, that is one of the primary reasons that Haiti has been impoverished economically, is because they, in fact, had to pay back that government had to pay back to France land lost, right? And lands lost, sugar, the enslaved peoples were counted as money, right? As possessions, right? All of the billions of dollars that was. Haiti then had to make payment to France. And then people go, why would they have had to do that? Well, because France still had ships, and they were still constantly, they were in the sea, right? And so within a US context, when we learn US history and we learn about Jefferson and we learn about Madison and spheres of influence, and the idea of they were very much against, in the United States context, they were against European invasion, right? They were not thinking specifically about Haiti necessarily. They were thinking about themselves, right? Great Britain, and there was just the War of Great Britain in 1812. But there was that constant threat. And again, to land on Haitian land meant to automatically be free, right? Think about this. When we think about, this is another way in which, it's particularly frustrating for historians who only think about the French Revolution and the US Revolution, because I'm a Latin Americanist. And, when I say America, I mean the hemisphere, hence the US Revolution. So the United States doesn't recognize Haiti as an existent nation until 1862, which is during its civil war. Meaning, again, if the United States doesn't recognize it diplomatically, and the US is also always sending out ships, right, to protect its borders, to protect the ships carrying enslaved peoples and other goods, right? That means that their possible trade with the island was curtailed, because there were no diplomatic relations, right? And again, the United States was already one of the main players, right, in the field. The other, in the scope of things, right? The other thing, again, is Haiti is the only country, like it becomes free, it is still surrounded by slave-owning nations, right? And so when we think about freedom of enslaved peoples next door in the Dominican Republic, right, it is because Haiti is free, and then there is the unification of the islands, or depending on who you're talking to, the occupation, the invasion, 1822 to 1844, right? But people don't know that history. People don't know that by definition in the first iterations of the Haitian Constitution, to be free was defined as to be Black. Specifically, it did not matter about biology. There was a group of Polish soldiers, right, who came because they were fighting against Bonaparte. And so they were in support of the revolution, right? They automatically became citizens, not because they were literally Black, phenotypically Black, but because to be free was to be Black. And so for me, it is really important to think about how would that impact political science as a field, right? If we took seriously the lessons of the Haitian Revolution, if we thought about the construction of constitutional studies, right? So very important in this country right now. If we actually took into consideration Haiti and their first constitutions and implemented those and extracted and extrapolated from those constitutions, what effect would those have on how we think and how we conceive of constitutions in this country?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that the thing that I find fascinating to a certain degree is that Haiti sort of is a good example of sort of the way that the Afro diaspora is sort of seen broadly, I think, in the hemisphere. I think one of the things that I think is important, thinking through some of the stuff that you were saying about sort of they have this revolution, they declare their independence, they are a free Black republic, and then they're saddled with this insurmountable debt, right? And I know that sort of happens also in the United States when it comes to post-Civil War and the 40 Mules and a Slave and thinking through Johnson and stuff like that, you know, after Lincoln gets assassinated. But as a republic, they're saddled with this debt and they really can't get out from under it. That has real material consequences for the people of Haiti to this day. And I'm going to skip a little bit to sort of round out the discussion around here. We'll come back to that and this image. You do not have to read this whole long. I sort of went big with the quotes for this conversation. But as I think a lot of you guys know, Haiti had this devastating earthquake in 2010, and it really devastated both the economy, the political system, insurmountable also, or an unthinkable sort of life toll also. And Junot Diaz, who's a Dominican-American writer, wrote this essay in 2012 in the Boston Review called Apocalypse: What Disasters Reveal. And one of the things that he says is, again, we're not going to read the whole thing, but it says, so the earthquake that devastated Haiti, what did it reveal? Well, I think it's safe to say that first and foremost, it revealed Haiti. And in particular, he goes on to discuss how it revealed Haiti to the world, this country that I think in the both global and American consciousness was just sort of this island nation that nobody knew of, but it really revealed the material impact of the global epistemological sort of erasure, but at the same time, the real material impact and how those two things are connected. I was wondering if you could sort of discuss a little bit how this sort of Haiti and the Dominican Republic sort of play at each other, which is something that you do discuss in your text. And it's something that I study also, the way that it's their relationship as two countries is quite, it's not as clear cut as I think oftentimes people like to make it out to be, and just sort of engage with sort of the racial discourse on the one end, but also the real impact that we see today with that earthquake.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's interesting, right? Particularly, this is a decade ago, and we could say, we can make similar conclusions about what the pandemic revealed for this country, right? I.e. things that inequities that have existed, that have been structural, that have been by design, and yet most of us kind of, do. And so, we compare ourselves to Canada or Western Europe again, or Australia with regards to a healthcare system and things like that, right? When we see the impact of devastation, how that is inequitably distributed, particularly on populations of African descent, Black, Latinx, right, Indigenous in this country. It's a similar thing, not the same, but similar. I relate to, when I talk about Haiti and Dominican Republic in my classes, I start with, so here you have an island, right? One complete island. And then you have European powers who carve out that island, right? Mm-hmm. Because when we talk about the moving border, what settles to be Saint Domingue and Santo Domingo doesn't happen until the 17th century, right? And so again, we have 200 years in which, you know, Spain controls that, and then they lose something, and then France goes, no, we have this half, and France controls it, and then Spain comes in, and all of this happens in the European theater, right? And so the relationship between the spoils of war that are in the Caribbean Sea, you know, thousands of miles away from where it happens. But I relate it to when we think about family. When one is growing up, there comes a stage where someone says, I'm not like my mom, I'm not like my dad, I'm not like, you're trying to individuate, right? And no, we might be similar, but don't say we're like that, right? And it's a very interesting thing because we see that phenomenon much more with the Dominican Republic in terms of national imaginary, right, than we do with Haiti, right? Mm-hmm. We see that kind of, Haiti doesn't define itself in contraposition to the Dominican Republic, whereas the Dominican Republic was struggling to separate itself, to be different, right, from Haiti. And part of this is that there is an elision, right? There is, even folks into the 19th century, well into the 20th century, one of the things that I adore about Dixa Ramirez's book, Colonial Phantoms, right, is that she speaks about that, right? That people are always referencing the entire island as Haiti. And so Dominican Republic gets lost, right? And to this day, we, without thinking about it, we say, you know, island nation, referencing both countries, right? Like Dominicans do it and Haitians both do it, right? And in that way erase effectively the other side, right? And so it's the history of that. It's not so clear cut. You know, when we think about, again, where the centers of publication are, more likely, you know, where the centers of power are on that island, you know, on the Dominican side, it's Santo Domingo, right? And so then we know Santo Domingo and the elite on that island will phenotypically, you know, these are folks, there's a national imaginary that claims very strong alliance to Spain, right? To Hispanism, right? And so there's real investment in that discourse that then gets, you know, distributed, populated, you know, to all of the islands in curricula, in things like that. So irrespective of how people actually look, right? There is an alliance with that. And in many ways, I mean, when we move out of the coast and we move further into the interior of that island, right? Then we have folks who, again, and I really love that Dominican studies as a field is growing, and we are very much recovering these histories, recovering, you know, those figures that actually write about, you know, a unified Haiti, what that looked like, because in that period that I mentioned of 1822 to 1844, that side of the island was Spanish Haiti, right? Like that was the name of it. And there were people that were in support of that, that unification, right? And so that becomes contentious. So again, the strength of Dominican studies at the moment, and it is it's growing, you know, but scholars who are doing that work, Ann Eller's book, right? Like there are books, there are scholars who are recovering, particularly that 19th century moment, right? And really coming to understand and grapple with, and as well as, you know, scholars on the island for years, Frank Moya Pons, right, has written this work as well, you know, and really deconstructing and examining and analyzing, right, how this discourse that for the United States, you know, if you've seen Black in Latin America, which many people saw on PBS or have read the accompanying book, right, it's Dominicans equal anti-Haitian. That's it, right? And it's as you said, it's so much more complex than that. There are people who are invested in that discourse, and then there are people who are very much, what are you talking about? We are of Haitian heritage, right? We are Dominicans, we are of Haitian heritage, or we're Haitians of Dominican heritage, right? And so the interplay of nationalism, and it's sometimes, you know, one could argue many times insidiousness, right? And how it divides a people. You know, for me, it always makes me question to what end, right? Who is benefiting from this, and what are the benefits from this?
Yeah, no, because Diaz in this article goes on to discuss, sort of give concrete examples after the earthquake where like the first responders were Dominican into the island, among other sort of aid that you see. I think Eduardo Paulino also has a really interesting text as through a history lens of the way that it's not so cut and dry, which way like that discourse that the anti-Blackness that you see oftentimes defining Dominican national constructs. One of the things that I think is also, but thinking through that anti-Blackness, how you see that around Latin America too, Puerto Rico having it too, with the sort of very problematic racial constructs, Cuba, Argentina, Mexico. I'm going to go backtrack a little bit, which is how, and maybe this isn't necessarily the case, but in your text, in your introduction to racialized visions, you say that the metaphor most often used in relation to Haiti, and more specifically its revolution within Latin American historiography, particularly in the Hispanic Caribbean, is that a spectral presence that haunted the region. I was wondering if you could sort of talk about it. I really like this idea of the spectral presence and the notion of haunting. I know Dixa Ramirez also has the colonial ghosts, colonial phantom, sorry, her text that also sort of discusses sort of this haunting that exists there and the legacy. But if you could speak a little bit towards that spectral presence.
So Haiti was literally used throughout the hemisphere, again, in its aftermath, all of the slaveholding societies increased surveillance of their enslaved peoples. There were laws against, there were already some laws against drumming, for example, or gatherings of peoples, right? Those became more restrictive, right? Again, throughout the hemisphere, right? And this doesn't stop, and I include, and people don't know this, right? Canada, right? Mexico, everybody had enslaved Africans and their descendants, right? And so when I say that the revolution was the justification for an increased rate of torture, of murder, of enslaved peoples, right? And so when one goes into the archive, or when one studies or even reads the books of historians who have done this work, right? It was therefore for those in power, right? Haiti was an incredible threat, right? And so they wanted to make sure it wouldn't happen there, right? So for example, when we think about Cuba, Cuba has 3 wars of uprising, right? It has the 1868 moment, it has 1868 to 1878, right? It has the first llamada, and then 1881 to 82 is the second war, 1895 to 1898, which is when the United States gets in the scene, right? 3 wars, right? Most of that time, Cuba being a colony of Spain at the time, one of the remaining colonies, the other one being Puerto Rico in this hemisphere, most of those soldiers were Afro-Cubans. And so when the Spanish troops wanted to threaten those criollos, right, who were on the Cuban, on the lands of Cuba, they would say, don't fight with them. We don't want another Haiti, right? And that was published, that was in writing, right? So throughout, from 1804, we don't want another Haiti. And so Haiti becomes that presence. And then when we come into the 20th century, it continues to be that presence, right? And so people, Gino Lease writes about this brilliantly, why we need new narratives, right? The defining narratives of Haiti being a revolution and impoverishment, as if those are the only 2 metrics. And again, by who, right? Who is doing these things? And yet we repeat. So anytime anything happens to Haiti, right? It's the most impoverished nation. Yeah, as if like, what else can you expect from poor people, right? And it's kind of, well, wait, what? And then either you go to Haiti, or you talk to Haitians, or you talk to Haitian Americans, or you talk to diaspora, it's a very proud people who they will roll out their history, and say, if we think about the conditions under which these peoples have fought for all of these years, right? Including where we're going to get to now, because, there is a reason why Jacob Lawrence in 1939 produces these series, right? There's something happening in Haiti. and Haiti comes into the US public presence in the early 20th century. And so that is when, it is sadly moments of incursion, moments of tragedy, when Haiti comes into the US consciousness.
Yeah. No, I think it's sort of a perfect segue. Thinking through, I'm going to bring up this image, which is sort of, it's called General Toussaint. One of the things that I wanted to think through in this conversation is the intellectual impact of this revolution on obviously we see the political, right, throughout the 19th century, but thinking through this image, but also through the way, you know, he's an African-American who gets knowledge of, and you can speak to that in a second, on from Arturo Schomburg, right? So an Afro-Puerto Rican in New York. But then also we think through, for example, C.L.R. James, the Black Jacobins, you know, from, I'm blanking the country he's from, not the Hispanic world, but you also have Alejo Carpentier en el Reino de este Mundo, or the Kingdom of this World, that also looks at a figure that's very similar. And he, you know, we know explicitly that Toussaint plays a huge role, where the imaginary also becomes this important engagement and critical understanding for the region. So I was wondering if you could speak either to this image or to the intellectual impact of the revolution beyond sort of the political material that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I mean, the power of this image is that what's interesting is, and it is true, both, not only both, Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, right, the Haitian leaders that come after him assume, right, I was going to say the trappings, but, you know, the decorations of empire, right? Haiti then becomes a republic. It later becomes, very quickly after, becomes an empire, right? Henri Christophe, right? And so here we see some, you know, what Lawrence does in this is, it is based on etchings at the time, or, you know, in the 19th century, but it is, again, putting him in that space of the great man of history, right? And so when we think about folks like, you know, fathers of the nation, right? General George Washington, and it's in that line, right? So then you're seeing an elevation, a recovery and an elevation of one man, right? As if to make, it's interesting to me because it is, I don't really get into artists' intentions or not, because, you know, as literary critics, it doesn't matter. We don't really think about that, but it does make him more legible, right? As someone that is worthy of respect when he's in that decoration, right? Which is, it's an interesting thought. Yeah, as far as the 20th century impact of this, so Jacob Lawrence does this work in 1939. The United States has invaded the island and occupied the island at that time from 1915 to 1934 with Haiti, and then 1916 to 1928 with the Dominican Republic. And so at this time, when we think about zombies, you who have written on that figure, right? When we think about zombies, when we think about Haiti, in particular, the recovery of Toussaint Louverture, the recovery of the revolution is very much happening at this time. So Eugene O'Neill writes Emperor Jones in 1920 with a similar figure, right, on an unnamed island, and someone who is then trapped by European forces, which is like the end of the revolution and what happens with Toussaint Louverture. So we have Orson Welles does, as part of the Federal Theater Project, he stages a Macbeth in 1935, and that is set on the island of Haiti, right? There's a play called Haiti. You know, there's in popular culture at this time, right? Langston Hughes is going to Haiti. Catherine Dunham later is going to, Zora Neale Hurston writes Their Eyes Were Watching God, her perhaps most famous novel in 1937, in, I think it's about 7 weeks while she's in Haiti, right? And so people are, Alejo Carpentier visits Haiti, right? Visits Haiti, sees the citadel, and is inspired to think of, and then constructs what we know as magical realism, but it's not that. You know.
El Real Maravilloso.
There we go. El Real Maravilloso, right? And so that idea of, you know, he feels like he touches, he gets into in a different way, he enters in a different way Caribbean reality by going to Haiti, right?
Right.
So you have all of these intellects going. Rafael Daleo, he's written a book on the impact of the revolution, but the impact of Haiti in particular on radical movements, right? Including C.L.R. James, right? And the Black Jacobins, and including all of these, Pedro Albizu Campos, 1933, right? So there's uprisings happening at that time. The the questioning of, certainly of the US incursion in the Caribbean, because the US in this moment, early 1910s, right, is really expanding in terms of power. Like it's in an imperial kind of way. And so this is a way, what is most interesting to me is when African-American artists, who again are citizens of this country, are then negotiating what are the ramifications of empire. Do they have an automatic affinity? Sometimes not necessarily so with the people of color, with Caribbean peoples. Are they also implements of empire, right? And so how African-Americans are negotiating all of this at the time, it's really interesting. Right. Jacob Lawrence does not go to Haiti. I just mentioned a whole bunch of people that went to Haiti. Jacob Lawrence went to the 135th Street Library, where there was a man named Arturo Schomburg. And Arturo Schomburg had, in 1926, his private collection of 10,000 items, books, pamphlets, prints, anything and everything testifying to global Black excellence, was bought by the Carnegie Corporation and for the explicit purpose of donation to the New York Public Library. And it was the it was the core collection of what was then the Division of Negro History, Literature, and Prints. And so fundamental to Arturo Schomburg was Haiti. And so he was doing a whole bunch of collecting, again, of primary documents, of secondary documents about this revolution, but also about the aftermath of its revolution. And in 1925, he had written The Negro Digs Up His Past, which has become an exhortation, right? The necessity of recovering that which has been lost. Again, this is a full circle moment to our beginning of our conversation and to Yo, right? There is the answer to that. How do you deal with an unimagined, right, history, right? Well, here comes Arturo Schomburg. And again, this Black History Month, when we see, visions of the use of the word Sankofa, right? That African tenet of we must recover the past. You cannot move forward without knowing where you come from, right? And that's how it comes throughout this. And so again, Haiti at this time, and the Haitian Revolution in particular, is one in which people, particularly not only exclusive to African Americans, but its symbolism, right? The potential of rising up against empire. That is what this revolution is held up for peoples of color in particular, but throughout the hemisphere.
No, this is sort of the perfect segue to sort of the final question. I taught last semester a class called The Afro-Americans, Race, Power, and Subjectivity, and we read this text by Denise Yvonne Rosario. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, or Capa Prieto, and she has a short story. Yeah. And she talks about that archive that you just talked about with Arturo Schomburg. But it made me think, though, as you were saying, sort of that idea of that which has been lost, but the way that art can be used, and not just art as in visual art like we're focusing on today, but thinking through literature of Denise Yvonne Rosario, but even, for example, looking at this text right now called They Came Before Columbus, sort of thinking through how Africans, and how can these different or even the Black Jacobins, how these different sort of artistic expressions can help us think through those voids, how they can help us think through that which has been lost. And just that would be sort of the final question before we open it up to the audience.
Yeah, it's fascinating when we think about, there are a lot of people who never knew about the Mirabal sisters until Julia Alvarez's work, right? There are people who never knew about the massacre in Haiti until Edwige Danticat, right? And her novel, right there. And so there continues to be a surge of recovery work that happens in the arts, right? There is an accessibility there. And so in some ways, we are living through an interesting moment where the 1619 Project is a flashpoint, right? Because it is, again, a battle of who tells our story, right? Our national story. What art does is it bypasses academic and, academic curricula and all of the things, and it is accessible to the masses, right? And so that it is for that reason that it's much more subversive, right? Because you don't have to go to a classroom, right? You don't have to go, you can talk to your elders, right? You can learn a poem, right? Edwige Danticat, and write and creating dangerously, right? That writing, that collection about writing, and talking about, she writes thinking about those who risk their lives to access art, right? I mean, and so the urgency of writing, right, of creating art in some spaces, right? We recognize, particularly in the social media age, the transmission of these ideas, right? And they don't have to come in the academy. More often than not, they don't come from the academy, right? And it's one of the reasons why I adore working on Arturo Schomburg and talking about Arturo Schomburg in particular, because here was a man who was surrounded by PhDs who had gotten a high school diploma, and yet who was constantly reading, constantly gathering, constantly collecting, right? And he wasn't the only one. And so he was in a network of peoples who do that work. And to this day, what we consider an archive, right? It doesn't necessarily mean a file folder with, papers, right? Your grandparents' memories, those are archives, right? It is all these stories, it is all that which is written down and all that which is not. The music, the dances, the food that we continue to, we partake in on any given day. We are accessing the archive. We ourselves are living archives, right? And so it is important, again, yes, of course, if we have access to document it, yes, absolutely. And knowing that by art, sometimes it is more accessible through the arts than it is through the written word.
No, I think that's beautifully stated. With that, we can go ahead and open it to the audience. I don't know if people have questions or any topics that people would want to continue to engage with. But thank you so much for discussing.
No, thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa and Nico, for that conversation and for sharing your insights. While I wait for some folks to type up some questions, I'll hand it over to Jessamine, who I know also had a question.
Yeah, thank you both. Echoing what Alex said, that was a terrific conversation. The question I have is related to the specific contexts of Jacob Lawrence's making. And so you both had discussed the 1930s context, because that's the first time that Lawrence, as a young man, makes this huge series, 41 of them. And what we actually have in our collection at the museum, though, is the print series. So it's late 1980s, so I loved hearing about the early 20th century context. But I'm wondering if you can say a few words about the 1980s, early 90s context, because I know Jean-Claude Duvalier was also a feature, a prominent figure in Haiti at the time that might have prompted Lawrence to revisit this. I mean, there's a 50-year difference between these two acts of making of the series, and it remained important for him. So I'd love to hear about that.
No, I think immediately when we think about Haiti in the 80s, we're thinking about, certainly the end of the Duvalier regime, right, in 1986, but it had been one father and son for almost 25 years, right? So decades in which the Duvaliers had controlled the islands. And unlike in the 1930s, when, after the US leaves, there's a series of presidents, right? So, but there's still, a functioning attempt at democracy, right? Lawrence lives through and witnesses what dictatorship looks like, right? And so the thing about the revolution, again, when one reads the history of Toussaint and the rise of Louverture, and then the rise of Dessalines, and then the rise of Henri Christophe, right? He is a dictator, right? Immediately after. And so working through the lingering effects of dictatorship and questioning what is freedom, what is not, right? Has a whole different resonance. 1930s, we're talking FDR and what this society, what the then presidential priorities were at the time. That's, that's fighting against the Great Depression and a US investment, governmental investment, right? In progress of peoples. We can debate, how much of an effect that actually had on the African-American population, but we had the Works Progress Administration. We did have starting, an investment in the government. 1986, we're talking Ronald Reagan, right? We're talking a disinvestment, right, in terms of governmental interactions, right? We're talking about, you know, the rise of the stereotype of the welfare queen, right? The rise of AIDS, right? And again, the stigma that was attached to the Haitian population at that time, right? Boat people, things. So again, we see a rise in which Haiti enters a US consciousness, again, in a negative way. And so I do think it was fertile grounds for Lawrence to rethink and revisit this series. Nico, you can add something that wasn't just to me.
I'm thinking sort of a little bit more like sort of thinking through the wet foot, dry foot policy in the United States and sort of the impact that that has, how you have, for example, at the end of that special period in Cuba where tons of Cubans are coming, fleeing sort of the economic decline, and they're being caught off the coast of the United States. And the Clinton administration in the 90s begins this thing called the wet foot, dry foot policy, where if the Cuban lands on the US soil, they're allowed to stay and seek asylum. But if they don't, they got to return back to Cuba by the US Coast Guard. But that type of benefit, let's say, is not extended to Haiti, and the economic reality, as we mentioned earlier in the conversation, the economic reality that they're witnessing from this legacy of the exclusion and erasure that occurred there. And I think that it's important, and it's something I do in my classes, sort of make those links for students, that it wasn't just like, oh, well, they were dismissed, it's not important, it doesn't matter to us today, but it really has these real material impacts then, 150, 180 years later. So not quite 1980s, but definitely thinking through sort of the next decade in the way that the US administrations, but then thinking through after the earthquake, how many millions of people seek asylum here. The US grants sort of some reprieve, but then the Trump administration rescinds it arbitrarily, right? When they seek, and they're not allowed to stay, they're not extended the grant to stay, and they got to go to a country that's still devastated years out. And how that's not by accident, right? It's still part of this consciousness that I think both people in the West and America specifically have about the way that we view Haiti as a sort of a nation. And people are suffering. People have, it's not just sort of in the literature and the books that we read and study. These are people's lives, and it stems from and it's linked to that erasure. I think Trujillo sort of sums up that impossibility quite well, and I'll leave it there.
Another question I had was about the relationship between Arturo Schomburg and Jacob Lawrence. I would just love to hear a little bit more about that historical dialogue as well.
So Jacob Lawrence lands, his family's in Harlem, right? Like he lives in Harlem, in central Harlem. Again, the 135th Street branch, which today is the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, on 135th and Lenox Avenue, Malcolm X Boulevard. Down the block, on 135th Street, is the Harlem YMCA, right? Around that area, right? So Lawrence is taking classes in the YMCA. Arturo Schomburg, for decades already, is not only collecting, he leaves New York for a brief period. He becomes the curator at Fisk University, right? The curator of their libraries there, and then in 1929, and then returns to New York in 1932. And from 32 to his death in 38, he continues collecting, right? He continues, again, bringing together all of these evidences of what we use the term Black excellence, but really Black presence everywhere throughout the country. And so Jacob Lawrence, he cites these two books when he was giving interviews about the works. He talks about accessing Mr. Schomburg's Haiti collection. He talks about learning about Haiti by being in the 135th Street branch, right? And speaking with him. And so it's a phenomenal thing to think about. I live close to the Schomburg Center, and I'm very blessed to do so, because every single corner, not just in that building, but throughout Harlem, you want to talk about walking the steps of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and Walter White and Marcus Garvey, right? All there, right, in that center. And everybody knew Arturo Schomburg, right? And before his collection was bought, you know, people would travel out to Brooklyn to go see his work there. And so, you know, it is a testimony, again, to the power of libraries in particular, and to archives, and in the creation of art, how people access those imaginative spaces whereby they were inspired to create.
Yeah. I agree. I think when just to add to that, because the students didn't quite get that when I taught the Capaprieto, where she sort of reinvents a conversation that Schomburg has with a person who's like, who does that archive belong to? That in the story that she creates, that archive was supposed to stay in Puerto Rico, right? And there were certain things that needed to be, and these were owned by the people of Puerto Rico. And it's sort of an interesting conversation, and does speak to the power of literature to sort of imagine these possibilities, imagine also and think through possibilities. I see that we do have a question. I don't know. I could read it.
I'll read it out here really quick. Why do you think it's important for undergrads to know about Lawrence's work relative to Haitian history?
All right, Professor Ramos Flores, that's all you.
I actually had the privilege of going last semester and showing Lawrence's work to the class that I was teaching. I think the thing that in particular both Lawrence's work in the Haitian Revolution shows a connection that I think students oftentimes miss, is like these movements didn't occur in isolation, right? Like it wasn't just that Langston Hughes was sort of sitting in his apartment in New York engaging with these topics, but they were all talking to each other, right? They were all engaging. That the Harlem Renaissance in particular wasn't just an intellectual movement in the United States, but rather it was a regional and even global phenomenon that, you know, sort of to use your words, sort of highlights the Black excellence and highlights those moments of resistance, the commonalities and the nation state specific nature. And I think what Lawrence's prints provide is those connections, but also centering a Black man's experience through this revolution. And it's important to sort of highlight that for undergraduates too. It provides sort of the intersections of the power of art and literature in understanding these historical moments.
I do think he's also providing a really important intervention, and not only in art history most broadly, right? But I mean, again, we see the intersections of art and history, right? And Black artistic production, when one is centering that perspective, right? Again, for whom is something impossible, right? And so we see visually, we see the manifestation, the realization of that which becomes possible. So I think it's important for undergrad. I think it's important for anyone to be able to access that art, not just undergrads.
I do see this question here real quick. I don't know if you could speak probably to this. Vanessa says, do you happen to know if Jacob Lawrence might have attended the lecture in Harlem in 1939 given by Haitian writer and activist Jacques Roman?
I don't know. I personally don't know, though there probably, I will say I don't know. There is a high probability, again, because he is plugged in. Again, Jacob Lawrence is not by himself, right? His teacher, one of his teachers is Augustus Savage, right? Like everyone's connected, right? So Langston Hughes is coming in. Langston Hughes is great friends with Jacques Roman, and probably one of the reasons that Jacques Roman was in Harlem at that time. And so while I personally don't have any evidence of it, it also probably would have been reported by the Amsterdam News here in New York as well.
Okay. I see that there's another question here. So Julianne Gillen is asking, thinking about how printmaking in particular has continued to be a medium that has interwoven with revolution, uprising, and political activism for so long, precisely because of its accessibility and its mass producibility. They're wondering about other visual forms that have had a similar resonance and legacy in the hemisphere.
No pressure. No, it's interesting to me because, again, when we think about, you know, the power of ingenuity, right, is taking the most basic of techniques, of materials, right? And what can be produced in that way, right? And so when we think about massive shifts in the world, right? Radio technology and what that did, right? For access to music, for example, and different populations, you know, the rise of jazz in this country is because of the radio, right? The rise of samba and song and all these other Black musical forms happens because of the radio, right? And so, while I personally at this moment cannot think of other visual realms that allows for this, you know, I immediately think about, I personally, as an Afro-Latin Americanist and Afro-Latinx scholar, I think about the revolution that Twitter has enacted, quite frankly. I think about the access, you know, of all of this information that folks have shown. They don't have to have a PhD, they don't have to have a master's degree. You know what? Someone's going to be really inventive and put it on a TikTok and put it on Facebook and put it on, and you know, we need to have access, of course, to the internet. But that has revolutionized, from my perspective, the dissemination of this of this field. I mean, part of the growth of the unpopularity of this field is the rise of social media as well. And so, yeah, I know that wasn't specific to art, and forgive me for that because that's not my specialty. My brain went everywhere else but art.
Yeah, I know that Kayla Ladingham says murals as a sort of a possibility within Absolutely. That realm. I was thinking particularly photography, thinking through, for example, and which is a little bit the Emmett Till's imagery. I don't know if that would have sort of a broad hemispheric impact, but I definitely think in the United States it sort of had its moment of political action. But that was sort of an example that I think.
And to your point, I mean, Instagram, certainly murals did at the time as well, right? I mean, we talk about this. This is the moment of, you know, the muralists and Diego Rivera and Diego Rivera in particular, and his work in the United States, and Nelson Rockefeller destroying his work because it doesn't abide by, you know, democratic ideals, and absolutely murals. But again, when it comes to, I mean, yeah, I agree with both of those, you know, into today and Instagram, you know, and both in its, you know, beyond I think we have gotten so far away from, remember when Instagram first came around and it was almost always selfies, right? And then like, we've gone so far away from that. There's some people who continue to do that, but we see, you know, it truly as a tool of political uprising in different spaces, including again, and in organizing, right? I mean, this pandemic was one in which, or certainly here in New York, where there were protests happening, people were letting folks know on Instagram and what, you know, and on TikTok. And so, yeah, I mean, I think again, those technologies are ones that are, they're when they're in the hands of, you know, of the people, they can be used for certain goods.
Yeah, no, I agree. I see that Jessamine, there's a question for you. I don't know if you want to take it and we can sort of head and close out the discussion here.
Sure, I'll answer it. The question is from Julia Lowe. Hi, Julia. She's curious to learn how students, faculty, and visitors are learning about the history and interacting with Lawrence's prints. I can say that this exhibition has been very, very popular across the curriculum at Colby. So many classes have visited across several departments. Nico's class was one from Spanish last semester, but French, history, anthropology, English. I mean, they're all coming to see it. And one common theme that we think about, and it ties back to what you, Vanessa, and you, Nico, have been talking about in thinking about the impossible history, or what are the silences. Something that we like to connect between Lawrence's actual practice of making these silkscreen prints is the process of silkscreen printing. It's the use of stencils, and he's literally filling in gaps with color. And so thinking about filling in those gaps and relating it to filling in the gaps of history is something that we do. And we often teach this work in the context of Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation as well. So thanks, Julia, for that question. Rest assured, a lot of Colby students have seen it. I think on that note, though, we are past time. So I would just really like to thank you again, Vanessa. Thank you, Nico, for this really engaging conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. And also thank you as well to our audience for all of their questions and their participation. Before we close off, I do just want to say one last thing. This is an art and program, so just a plug for the next one. It's called Learning to Look, Photography in Practice, talking about accessible media. That program is scheduled for March 10 at 6 p.m. and it's related to our active site, the Ciara's Family Photography Collection exhibition, which by the way, just opened today. So if you're interested and you want to learn more, please visit our website, colby.edu/museum. And with that said, thank you all very much. Good night and take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Vanessa. You guys have a good night.